Hello everybody and welcome to my video on the Kodak Pony 828 camera. The Kodak Pony 828 is an 828 film format viewfinder camera that takes 28mm by 40mm images, so that's slightly larger than 35mm frames. Has no light meter, a leaf shutter, shutter speeds of 1/25th to 1/200th of a second, as well as bulb, and the flash sync is any speed if you can actually find a flash for this camera, which I'm going to guess you can't. Because here's the flash port, and it uses an old-timey connector that they don't make anymore. So I'm just going to put the cover back on it, and we're going to pretend that never happened. There we go. We'll just pop the lens out right now. The earliest ones of these, of the 828, and I don't have a date range for that, by the way, for when this variation was made, included an embossed metal front plate and shutter dials, whereas the later ones, like this one, used screen printing for the screen. So if you have one of these and the text on the shutter dials and the plate here is embossed, it is an older version of these. These cameras provided an advantage over 135 cameras due to the larger frame size, but also, I'm going to argue, due to the fewer frames per roll. I don't remember how many are on an 828 roll, and I don't have any 828 film to use at all, that I don't think, for this video. But it was fewer shots, and that would allow you, if you are a more casual shooter, to get larger frames, which would give you a better small print, like a 3x5 or 4x6 print would look better. And it would also allow you to use, to not waste film or not have film sitting in the camera for months on end. If you are looking at shooting one of these today, and you can get yourself some 828 paper and spools, which isn't that hard, they're still out there, you can re-spool it with 35mm, but you will have part of the sprocket holes at the top and bottom of each frame. Not the whole sprocket hole, just a little bit of it. If you want a shooting experience that is much more like traditional 828 without the sprocket holes, you can pick up some 120 film and build or buy a slitter for it that will slit it down to the correct width. The target market for the Kodak Pony 828 camera was the casual shooter. It's a basic and inexpensive camera with a Bakelite body, and it used the very consumer-oriented 828 film. Oh, here it is in my notes. 828 film had 8 shots per roll. So, like I said, if you didn't want to shoot 36 and you only wanted to shoot maybe 8 in a day, this would be a perfect camera. This was produced by Kodak in New York from 1949 to 1959 across the entire, I think there were a few different versions of these. It was preceded by nothing that I could directly identify, as it was the first Pony lineup, first camera in the Pony lineup. It was concurrent with many, many other Kodak cameras, because Kodak just made tons of cameras, and that includes all of the other Pony camera models. And it was followed by nothing, as there was never, that I'm aware of, a Pony 828 version 2. Now, if you have your Pony 828, we're going to go through all of the different stuff on it as we do. We're going to start right here at the top, and kind of on the top. These little holes on the sides, on these metal bits, are for your camera strap, so you can put a strap in it. This is your film advance knob right here, and it only turns in the direction of film advance. Kodak logo, shutter button, and this is a film memo. So when you turn the dial here, whichever part of it turns, this is kind of jammed on there. Oh boy, that is stiff. Okay, we're just going to pretend that this is turning. There's a little black index there that you can use to set your reminder of your film type. Of these, none of them are made anymore. So the front of the camera doesn't have a whole lot. Make, model, the fact that it's a camera. Here's your lens. We're going to take a look at all of the different settings that and numbers and what all of those mean a little bit later in the video, because there's a lot to go over with this lens. On the camera's bottom, we have the serial number and the tripod socket. On the camera's back, we have this green window, which is what you look through to count the frames. 828 is a lot like small 120. So it's got a paper backing and you just count the frames off of it. To get into the camera, we come over here to this side and we push in this little button right there and push down on the silver lock here. Now this works really well as a camera strap because as long as you have the camera strap here and it's hanging around your neck, this will never come unlocked. You have to push it down for that. Then we'll remove the back and we can see inside of the camera. This is where the new 828 cassette goes. Here's your image taking area, and you can see that it is a fairly large image taking area. Some film guide rails to help keep the film moving through the camera. This is where the fresh 828 roll will go. And here is your film pressure plate with some information about your camera and getting Kodak film. So normally this is where I would load film and show you how to do it, but I don't have any. So the general process of it is that you would put an 828 roll in here, and then you'd pull out the paper like you would any roll film format, whether it's 120, 620, 127, whatever it is. Tuck the end of that roll of film into a slit in the spool on the 828 take-up area. Advance the paper backing until you saw an arrow right about here, and then you would close up the back of the camera. Just like that. Lock it in place. And then you just advance until you saw the number 1. And then you keep going until you got through all 8 of the shots on your 828 roll. Alright, so here we're going to go through everything that's on the lens and explain what everything is. Before you use the camera, you have to extend the lens. If you don't extend the lens, the camera's not going to take a photo. So you extend it by turning it counterclockwise a bit, pulling it out, and then locking it by turning it back clockwise. Now this lens is extended, so you can arm the lens and take a photo. That is very sluggish. Okay, so let's talk about what all of the different stuff here is. On top we have this dial here, which goes from 22 to a blisteringly fast 4.5. This is your aperture selection dial. So whatever you dial that to, it's going to be your aperture. This is your shutter speed dial. So what you want to do is just pick your shutter speed, and then that's what your shutter speed is going to be. This lever arms your shutter, and then once your shutter is armed, you use the shutter release to take a photo. That is super sluggish. This is your focus helicoid right here. So as you unscrew it, you focus closer, and there's a little black triangle on the top and that little black triangle is an index to show you where exactly you are focused. There we go, like that. Now on the front of the lens you can see some numbers here, and they go up from 4.5 to 22, mirroring each other. And if you recall from the aperture setting, those numbers go from 4.5 to 22. That's not a coincidence. These red numbers work with that black triangle and the focus scale on your focus part of your lens right here to tell you what all is going to be in focus. So let's say that we are set at, that's 22, let's go to f11, just like that. And let's focus to wherever this is, because I can't even see that from my perspective. What's the screen say? I can't tell. Anyway, whatever that number is, when you're set to f11, everything from the 11 to the 11 is going to be in focus, and that's the feet that are in focus. All right, what if we went to f22? Well, if we switch to f22, now everything from f22 to f22 is in focus. So that's how you use the focusing scales to figure out what's going to be in focus at a given setting with your aperture. But if we focus down all the way to infinity, and we're at f22, right now, everything from infinity to as close as 8 feet is in focus. And that's just a huge waste because everything on this side of the dial is just wasted focus. So you can do something called hyperfocal distancing, which is getting the maximum amount of the scene in focus. So you're going to set this to f22. Make sure, of course, you have enough light to do f22. You're going to dial your focus until the infinity is lined up with this 22 right there. And now everything from infinity to as close as 4¼ feet is going to be in focus. If you don't have quite enough light for f/22 and you're at f/16 and you set the infinity here, then everything from infinity to as close as 6 feet is in focus at f/16 with this lens at its maximum focus for f/16. So that's how those buttons or those dials and data points work. This is your flash socket. It is an old-timey flash socket. If they make adapters for them, I'm not aware of them. So with this camera, you are probably not ever going to shoot a flash. The timing for this camera will be with bulb flashes anyway. So if you got a modern flash for it, it probably would not be timed correctly. Most likely because bulb flashes take a little while to get bright, and then they peak at their brightness and then they get dim. Whereas modern flashes are just instantly bright, instantly dim. The old timing bulb flash sinks are timed to trigger the bulb prior to the shutter opening so that they can be their brightest when the shutter is open. So modern flashes fire before the shutter fires with these older cameras like this. All right, so now that we've covered all of that, let's see how to put it together and take a photo with this camera. It's pretty simple. You need to make sure, of course, that your lens is extended. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take a meter reading either with a light meter app on your smartphone or a handheld light meter. And we're going to know from that we want to use f/5/6. And we want to use 1/100th of a second. And that's appropriate for our scene. We also know, because we're going to kind of estimate it, that our subject is 4 feet away from us. So that also tells us that everything from about 3.5, 3 3/4 up to 4.5 feet is going to be in focus. We're going to arm the shutter. We're going to take a photo. It's that simple. And then after you've taken your photo, you need to just advance the film to the next number in the window. Okay, so what about double exposures? Well, this camera is a double exposure machine. It's very easy to do double exposures with it. The practice of doing a double exposure is that what you would do is find your settings, arm the shutter, take a photo, arm the shutter, take a photo, just like that. Very simple to do. The science behind it is that when you have a negative, it can receive a certain amount of light before it becomes too dark, and it will lose contrast. It will take a long time to print in the darkroom. It will have digital noise if you digitize it, if it's too dark. So if you put too much light onto some film, that is going to cause it some problems. So if you're going to do a double exposure, you want to cut the amount of light reaching the film for each exposure in half. So let's say your proper meter reading is 1/100th of a second at f/5/6. There are two ways to cut the amount of light in half. You can either cut the aperture in half, which would mean going to f8, because f8 is a smaller number than is is a smaller opening rather than is f/5/6. Or you can go from 1/100th of a second to 1/200th of a second. Personal preference, what you want to do. It's I find it a little bit easier to control double exposures with shutter timing, but however you want your image to turn out, that's how you control your exposure. So now we've cut the amount of light in half. We're going to take our first photo. We're going to take our second photo. That's that. And then we're going to advance until we get to the next number. And then whenever we are ready to go about doing our next photo, we just dial in the settings for that scene and take the photo then. All right, so some tips about using the Kodak Pony 828 now in the 2020s. If you've ever thought about re-spooling your own 127 or 620 film to use in a vintage camera, hot take, start with 828. The process is the same. You get some paper, you get an old spool, you start hand spooling it up in the dark, you put you have the film taped on in the correct spot, you start winding that up so that it's being taken up correctly. The reason that I say start with 828 is because 828 can use 35mm film. 100 feet of 35mm film is cheap. You can just get, you know, a third of a roll, about enough for about 12 exposures, will be more than enough to ensure that you cover the entire film area for this camera. And then get some spools and some papers for 828 and practice respooling and using it and seeing how it works. Once you get the muscle memory down, then you can move on to 127 and 620, which are going to be more expensive formats to respool. And once you get those down, then you can go on and try things like 124. Definitely not easy. Anyway, just remember, with 35mm film, you will get part of the sprocket holes on the top and bottom of each photo. Another thing is that these cameras are habitually inexpensive, and 828 is such a dead format with really nobody making it anymore that often these cameras will come with a roll of with a spool and some film in it, which will give you 2 spools and backing paper so you can get started practicing using one of these cameras and respooling your own film. I have used these before, by the way, and I will say that the lenses on them are serviceable. I think that's the best word for them, but they're not exciting. Images are a bit soft with only minor exciting out of focus area characteristics. So if you have a parts grade Pony 828, it might be fun to adapt the lens to a mirrorless camera, but I wouldn't expect that you're going to discover the next Aero Ektar or Dallmeyer Pentac that way. And that's really it for this camera. A lot of fun, very simple to use. A couple really quick tips: just don't store it in a car, just to keep the lubricating oils in the lens from getting thick and gummy, because if they get thick and gummy, what can happen is this. That is still open. That's the longest 50th of a second in human history right there. Anyway, that's really the best advice. Also, these are, I think that these are uncoated lenses, if I remember correctly. Nope, they're coated. They have purple reflections. Anyway, don't store these in a plastic bag or box unless you have a really good rechargeable desiccant pack, because fungus can grow on the lenses, which can kind of muck up your lens's performance beyond anything where it is right now. And just really have fun with these cameras. If you are an 828 enthusiast or really want to try the wonky and bizarre 828 film format, it's going to be a lot of fun.